People say you learn who really loves you when you've got nothing left. For me, that lesson came the day my wife laughed while I cried. My name's Jack Sullivan. I'm 65 years old, and for 40 years, I worked every damn day to give my wife the life she dreamed of. A big house in Oregon, vacations in Italy, and a savings account that I thought would carry us peacefully into retirement. But love doesn't always fade quietly. Sometimes it rots from the inside. When I lost my business, my wife, Linda, looked at me like I was something she'd stepped on, and when I broke down in front of her trying to explain, she just crossed her arms and said, "Real men don't cry, Jack." That moment, that one sentence, shattered me. But what she didn't know was that the same day she left, the universe had already written the beginning of my revenge. It was a gray Wednesday morning when Linda packed her last box. The house smelled like dust and cheap perfume. She didn't even look back as the moving truck rolled down the driveway. "Where will you go?" I asked, standing by the door, my voice barely steady. She shrugged. "Anywhere but here, Jack. You made this place miserable. You used to be someone." "I'm still me," I said quietly. She laughed, that cruel, dry kind of laugh that makes you feel small. "No, you're a failure now. And failures cry." I'll never forget her walking out in those red heels, clicking against the porch steps like gunshots. I just stood there, gripping the doorframe, fighting the tears she said made me weak. When the truck turned the corner, I finally let go. I sat down on the floor of the empty living room, where we'd once danced to Sinatra, and I cried like hell. Not because she left, but because I realized I'd built my whole identity around someone who didn't even believe in me. For the next few weeks, I lived like a ghost. Bills piled up. Friends stopped calling. My body ached in places I didn't know could ache. The silence in that house was so loud it hurt. Then one morning, while I was drinking cold coffee from a chipped mug, the mailman knocked. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, "certified letter for you." I signed for it and opened it right there at the kitchen table. Inside was a thick envelope. Formal paper, old-fashioned handwriting, the kind you see in lawyer movies. It was from Robert Mercer, an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in decades. The letter said he'd passed away last month. I blinked in confusion. How could a dead man write to me? Then I saw the second page. It was from Robert's attorney. A will. And my name, written in bold print right under primary beneficiary. I thought it was a joke at first. Robert had been one of the wealthiest men I'd ever known, an investment genius who built empires. But we hadn't spoken since 1984. The letter said, "Mr. Mercer named you as the sole heir to his estate, per a handwritten will dated 3 months before his death. Please contact our office immediately." My hands started shaking. I didn't know what to think. Maybe Robert lost his mind before he died. Maybe this was a clerical error. But the lawyer's words wouldn't leave my head. "You have inherited everything. Liquid assets totaling $280 million. I laughed at first. Then I cried again, only this time it wasn't from sadness. Somewhere in the universe, karma had just poured me a glass of justice. And for the first time since Linda walked away, I felt alive again. The law office was in downtown Portland, on the top floor of a glass building that looked far too clean for a man like me. I hadn't been to a city office in years. My hands still smelled like machine oil from the garage I used to run, and my shoes had scuff marks older than the receptionist who greeted me. "Mr. Sullivan?" she asked with a polite smile. "Yeah," I said, trying not to look as nervous as I felt. "I got a letter about, well, something impossible," she nodded. "Mr. Crane is expecting you." The attorney's office was everything mine never was. Neat, quiet, and expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows, leather chairs, a single plant that looked too perfect to be real. Behind the desk sat Harold Crane, a thin man with gray hair and the kind of voice that never rushed. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, standing to shake my hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under such strange circumstances. Robert spoke highly of you." I hesitated. "Robert Mercer? We haven't spoken since the 80s. Are you sure this isn't a mistake?" He smiled slightly. "It's no mistake. Mr. Mercer was a man of few attachments, and the few he valued he never forgot. He opened a file and slid a document toward me. The will. My name was right there, printed clearly under the words sole beneficiary. I read it once, then again. This can't be right, I muttered. We were just college buddies. We lost touch after graduation. Crane leaned back. Robert often said you were the only man he ever trusted. He mentioned something about a promise you kept. My chest tightened. A memory flickered. 2 young men in a dorm room, one drunk and crying about his family's expectations. I'd kept his secret back then, never told a soul. I hadn't thought about it in decades. Crane continued. Mr. Mercer's fortune has been converted into liquid assets and placed in a private trust. After legal clearance, it will all be transferred to your name. I sat there speechless. How much are we talking about again? He looked me straight in the eye. $280 million. My mouth went dry. I tried to laugh, but it came out broken. I don't even know what to do with $20 right now. Crane didn't laugh. Mr. Mercer left a note for you. He opened another envelope and handed it over. Inside was a handwritten letter, shaky but still legible. Jack, if you're reading this, I'm gone. You once told me that good men always finish last, but I never believed that. You were the only real friend I ever had. You never wanted anything from me, and that's why I leave this to you. Use it to rebuild, not to destroy. Your old friend, Robert. For a long time I didn't speak. I just sat there, holding that letter like it was something holy. Then Crane said something that made my stomach twist. There's one more thing, he said quietly. Robert's death. It wasn't natural. The police called it an accident, but our firm isn't so sure. You might be inheriting more than just money, Mr. Sullivan. I looked up slowly. What do you mean? Crane folded his hands. Mr. Mercer made enemies, powerful ones. And if he trusted you with his estate, it means he also trusted you to finish something he started. I leaned back in the chair, heart pounding. You're saying someone killed him? Crane didn't answer directly. Let's just say, Robert's wealth came from people who don't like unfinished business. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. That night when I got home, I sat in my old recliner with the letter on my lap. Linda's side of the closet was still empty. Her perfume was gone, but her voice wasn't. Real men don't cry. I smiled to myself, a tired, bitter smile. Maybe not, I whispered, but real men remember. And for the first time, my tears weren't for her. They were for Robert, the man who gave me a second life, and maybe one final mission. The weeks after the divorce felt like a blur of humiliation and silence. Thomas Miller, once the man who owned his own home, who coached Little League baseball, who believed love meant sacrifice, was now just another old man renting a 1-bedroom apartment on the rougher side of Houston. He had sold nearly everything. The house, the truck, the tools, even his father's antique rifle. Susan had demanded her share of every penny, and the court had agreed. She walked away with the house, half his pension, and every ounce of his pride. Thomas could still hear her voice the day she left. Real men don't cry. Tom, maybe if you'd acted like one, I wouldn't have had to find someone who did. Those words burned deeper than any betrayal. Not because they were cruel, but because he had believed her once. He had believed that real men stayed quiet, swallowed pain, and endured. Now, he sat in that small apartment every night, staring at the walls, replaying their life together like a movie stuck on repeat. The sound of her laughter, her perfume on his old jacket, the sight of her name still on mail that wasn't yet forwarded, it was torture disguised as nostalgia. One evening, Thomas went for a walk through the old neighborhood. It was late autumn, and the air carried that dry chill before winter. He passed by his old house. The porch light was on, the curtains drawn. There, through the window, he saw Susan. She was pouring wine for a man in a suit. They laughed together. He froze. His chest tightened, not with love, but with something darker. The kind of pain that turns into steel if you hold it long enough. He whispered to himself, real men don't cry, maybe not. But they remember. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He opened his laptop and searched for something, anything that would distract him from the ache. He found himself on forums for men who'd lost everything after divorce. Stories of betrayal, broken homes, and quiet revenge. He read for hours. Then, buried deep in a thread titled, "When You've Lost It All, Start Over," one comment caught his eye. It read, "Rebuild yourself in silence. Let the world laugh. One day, they'll see you again, and they won't recognize the man they mocked." Thomas stared at the screen. It wasn't just advice. It felt like a challenge. He began running every morning, rain or shine. At first, he could barely make it a mile before gasping for breath. But by week 3, he was jogging 5. He started eating better, shaving daily, ironing his clothes, and keeping his apartment spotless. Small victories, but they built something bigger. A sense of control. He picked up freelance work fixing old engines. People in the neighborhood began to respect him again. Old Man Miller, they called him, the guy who can fix anything. But inside, Thomas was building something else. A quiet, calculated patience. He stopped checking Susan's social media. He stopped talking about her entirely. And the more he focused on himself, the more the bitterness turned into something sharper. 6 months passed. Then, out of nowhere, a letter arrived. The envelope was cream-colored, embossed with a gold seal. He almost threw it away, thinking it was junk mail, until he saw the return address. Law Offices of Dawson and Green, Boston, M.A. Inside was a single line. "Mr. Thomas Miller, you are the primary beneficiary of the late Harold Green's estate. Please contact our office immediately." Thomas blinked. Harold Green? The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He called the number. A soft-spoken assistant answered, confirming his identity before transferring him to a senior attorney. "Mr. Miller," the voice said, "I know this must be a surprise. Mr. Green passed away 2 weeks ago. His will lists you as the sole heir to his estate, valued at approximately $280 million. Thomas dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud. I think you've got the wrong man," he stammered when he finally picked it up. "I don't know any Harold Green." The lawyer chuckled gently. "Actually, you do. Or you did. Mr. Green was a Vietnam veteran. You repaired his generator 3 years ago when his power went out. He spoke often of your kindness and how you refused payment, saying, 'It's what neighbors do.' He never forgot that." For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. He just sat there, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Then a single tear rolled down his cheek. Not from pain, but from something unfamiliar. Justice. The same world that had stripped him of everything had just handed him back more than he ever imagined. And for the first time in years, Thomas smiled, not because he was rich, but because finally, he had the power to choose what came next. But he also knew one thing for certain. Susan would find out. And when she did, the woman who once mocked him for crying would finally understand what it meant when a man stopped crying and started remembering. For 2 days, Thomas barely left his chair. The letter from Dawson and Green lay on his kitchen table, perfectly aligned like a sacred document. Every time he walked past it, his chest tightened with disbelief. $280 million? The number didn't even sound real. He didn't tell anyone. Not a soul. The lawyer had arranged for a private flight to Boston to finalize the transfer, but Thomas insisted on flying commercial. He wore his oldest jeans, a faded blue jacket, and carried a single duffel bag. To everyone else, he looked like just another tired old man heading somewhere he didn't want to go. But in his mind, everything had changed. On the flight, Thomas stared out the window, thinking about Harold Green, the quiet man who'd lived down the road for years. He'd fixed that man's generator during a storm and refused his money. Just a small act of decency. He never imagined it would echo this far. Funny, Thomas thought. You spend a lifetime giving everything to people who betray you, and then kindness to a stranger changes your fate. When he arrived in Boston, the law firm's marble lobby made him feel small. But when the senior attorney shook his hand and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Miller, the estate is now fully yours," something inside him shifted. He wasn't small anymore. After signing the papers, They took him to see the properties, 3 in total. A massive estate in Vermont, a private cabin in Maine, and an ocean view mansion in Cape Cod. Thomas didn't say much. He just walked through each hallway slowly, running his hand along polished oak banisters, marble floors, and walls filled with silence. At one point, he stood in front of a window overlooking the ocean and whispered to himself, "This doesn't make me a man. What I do next will." That night, in the quiet of his hotel room, he made a decision. He would not waste this second chance. But before he built anything new, he needed to bury something old. He flew back to Houston. No one noticed his return. He still looked like the same man who ate lunch alone at diners and wore thrift store jackets. But something in his eyes had changed. Thomas drove to his old neighborhood one last time. The house still looked perfect, painted porch, trimmed garden, shining windows. He parked across the street and watched as Susan stepped out with the same man he'd seen months ago. Her laughter carried through the air, sharp and proud. It didn't hurt this time. It just confirmed what he already knew. She hadn't changed. 2 days later, a small package arrived at Susan's house. No note, no signature. Just a plain envelope inside containing a photocopy of a legal notice. Public transfer of assets, estate of Harold Green, to sole heir Thomas Miller. That night, Thomas turned off his phone. He sat back in his recliner, opened a bottle of bourbon, and waited. The first call came at midnight, then another at 12:30, then a text. "Susan, Tom, is this real? Susan, please call me. We need to talk. Susan, you can't ignore me, Tom. I made a mistake." He didn't reply. He simply placed the phone face down and smiled. By morning, the messages turned desperate. "Tom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean what I said. We can fix things. I miss you." The irony was almost poetic. The woman who once mocked him for showing emotion was now the one begging for mercy. Thomas poured himself another drink and whispered, "Real men don't cry. Remember?" For weeks, Susan kept trying. She sent letters, showed up at his old apartment, even called the mechanic shop asking about him. But Thomas had vanished from that world. He bought a small ranch on the outskirts of Montana. Quiet, isolated, with mountains stretching beyond the horizon. There, he rebuilt his life, this time for himself. He hired local workers, opened a small community center for veterans, and spent his days restoring old engines again. Not for money, but for peace. Word spread about the old man who'd suddenly turned into a millionaire yet lived like a farmer. People admired him, but no one truly knew what he'd endured to earn that peace. One winter evening, as snow began to fall, Thomas sat by the fire with a cup of black coffee. He turned on the radio, old country music playing softly, and thought of Susan one last time. He imagined her sitting in that same house, surrounded by things that no longer meant anything. A woman who had everything, except the one thing she could never buy back: respect. Thomas smiled, a quiet, almost sorrowful smile. Not out of arrogance, but closure. Because revenge, he realized, wasn't about hurting her. It was about healing himself in a way that made her regret losing him, and she did, every day. He sipped his coffee, leaned back, and whispered to the empty room, "Some lessons cost you money. Others cost you a soul." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless. And for the first time in years, Thomas Miller finally slept in peace. Winter passed quietly in Montana. The ranch became more than a retreat. It became therapy. Thomas rose early every morning, splitting wood before sunrise, feeding the horses, and walking the perimeter fence as the first light broke over the hills. The rhythm of hard, honest work steadied his mind, but peace has a way of drawing shadows. One afternoon, as he returned from town, a black SUV sat at the end of his dirt road. A woman stepped out. Long beige coat, high heels sinking into the mud. Even from a distance, he knew that posture. Susan. He didn't stop. Just drove past slowly, pretending not to notice until she waved her arms and shouted his name. "Tom! Please!" The voice carried desperation this time. He parked the truck halfway up the drive, stepped out and watched her walk toward him. For a second, he almost didn't recognize her. The confident, mocking woman he once knew had disappeared. She looked smaller now, tired, painted with regret. "I just wanted to talk," she said, her breath visible in the cold air. Thomas said nothing. "I know I hurt you," she continued. "I was stupid. I was angry. But you don't understand what I've been through since you left." "I understand perfectly," Thomas cut in. His voice was calm, not cruel. "You've been through what you put me through. Just from the other side." She flinched at his words. "Tom, please. I saw the papers. I know about the inheritance. I'm not here for that. I miss you." He studied her for a long moment. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked closer, stopping just a few feet away. "You miss the man you thought was weak," he said softly. "The one who cried, begged, and still tried to love you. But he's gone, Susan. You killed him the day you walked out." Her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, Thomas almost felt sorry. But then the memory of her laughter, the way she mocked him as she packed her bags, came rushing back. She wiped her face and tried again. "Can't we start over?" Thomas gave a small, tired smile. "Start over? You burned the house down, Susan. There's nothing left to rebuild." She stood frozen, hands trembling, unsure of what to say. He turned toward his truck. "Tom, please," she cried, her voice breaking. "I don't want your money. I just want to talk." He looked over his shoulder. "You've done enough talking for a lifetime." Then he got in and drove away. That night he sat on his porch watching the snow fall again. The air was sharp and quiet, the kind that made every sound feel sacred. He thought about what had just happened, the way her voice cracked, the fear in her eyes, and realized something unexpected. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel satisfaction. He just felt nothing. Because revenge isn't fire. It's ice, and when it finally settles, it leaves only silence. Over the next few months, Thomas's life found a new rhythm. He invested in local farms, paid off the debts of struggling neighbors, and created jobs for young veterans. People started calling him Mr. Miller, with respect in their voices, something he hadn't heard in years. But even as life grew brighter, a strange emptiness lingered. Late at night, when the ranch fell quiet and the fireplace dimmed, he'd catch himself remembering Susan's laugh. Not the cruel one, the one from before the bitterness. He'd think about how love can turn into something unrecognizable when pride gets in the way. One evening, while going through old boxes in the attic, Thomas found a dusty photo album. Inside was a picture of him and Susan from 1986, smiling, young, sitting on the hood of his first truck. She had written a note under it. "Our forever starts here." He stared at the photo for a long time, then closed the book gently and whispered, "Forever ended, where trust died." He didn't cry, not this time. The next morning, Thomas called his lawyer. "I want to set up a scholarship fund," he said, "for women who lost everything but want to rebuild. Call it the Susan Miller Foundation." The lawyer hesitated. "You sure about the name, sir?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Absolutely. Let it remind her that she could have been part of something good." The fund launched within months and gained attention nationwide. Reporters wanted to meet the reclusive millionaire who'd named a foundation after his ex-wife. Thomas declined every interview. He didn't want credit. He just wanted peace. That summer, a letter arrived in his mailbox. No return address. The handwriting was familiar. "Tom, I saw what you did. I don't know if it's forgiveness or punishment, but either way, thank you." "Susan," he read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same album with their old photo. That night, as the sky filled with stars, Thomas sat outside, the wind rustling through the trees. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't broken. He had turned his pain into something greater, something that outlived both of them. In the distance, thunder rolled, soft and low. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to the darkness, "Real men don't cry, huh? Maybe not, but they sure as hell learn how to rise." By the time spring touched the Montana hills, Thomas Miller had learned to live quietly. The ranch had become a kind of sanctuary, not one filled with ghosts, but with lessons. Every creak of the barn, every sunrise over the pastures reminded him that pain could teach you more than comfort ever could. Still, there were nights when he'd sit by the fire, stare at the embers, and feel a weight pressing behind his ribs. He had everything now: peace, respect, money, yet part of him couldn't shake the memory of how easily love could turn into cruelty. One morning, he received an unexpected call from the attorney handling Harold Green's estate. "Mr. Miller," the voice said, "there's something you should know. Harold had another account we didn't know about." "It's rather unusual," Thomas frowned. "Unusual how?" "There's a note in it. It's addressed to you." The lawyer faxed over a scanned page within the hour. Thomas unfolded it slowly. The paper looked old, the handwriting jagged but deliberate. "Thomas, if you're reading this, it means my time ran out before I could tell you face to face. You helped me once when no one else would. That day, you said something that stuck with me. Money can't save a soul that's already lost. I left you what I couldn't take with me, not because I owed you, but because I trusted you'd do something good with it. Don't waste it on revenge. Heal something instead. Maybe yourself." Thomas sat still for a long time. He remembered that stormy night. Harold's car had broken down near the edge of the county, and Thomas had stayed out in the cold fixing it while everyone else drove past. He'd never expected a thank you, much less an inheritance. But Harold had seen something in him, something Thomas had long stopped seeing in himself. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. He sat at his desk reading the letter over and over until his eyes blurred. Don't waste it on revenge. He realized he hadn't. Not really. He hadn't sought to destroy Susan. He'd simply chosen not to let her destroy him again. But still, something in the letter gnawed at him. The next morning, Thomas made a decision. He loaded his truck and drove 8 hours south, back to Texas. The roads grew familiar the closer he got. Gas stations, diners, street corners where he used to wait for Susan after work. Every mile felt heavier. When he finally pulled up outside the house they once shared, he didn't get out immediately. The lights were off. The once perfect garden looked tired and overgrown. He stepped out and stood at the gate, his breath visible in the cooling evening air. Susan opened the door before he could knock. For a moment neither of them spoke. She looked older. Not in years, but in weariness. Life had clearly taken its toll. "Tom," she whispered, her voice softer than he remembered. "You came back." He nodded. "Only for a minute." She stepped closer, uncertain. "Why now?" "Because I need to let go," he said quietly. She looked confused. "Let go of what?" He smiled faintly. "Of the part of me that still hates you." Susan's eyes filled instantly. She shook her head. "Tom, I never meant to—" "You did," he said gently, not cruelly. "And that's okay. You were who you were, and I was weak enough to think love could fix it. But now, I'm done carrying it." She started to cry, but he didn't move to comfort her. "That time was gone. I started a foundation," he said, his tone steady. "In your name. Helps women start over after losing everything. Thought you should know." Her lips trembled. "Why would you do that?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Because forgiveness isn't about you. It's about freeing myself." He turned and walked back toward his truck. Behind him, Susan's sobs echoed through the empty neighborhood. But Thomas didn't turn around. As he drove away, a strange calm washed over him. It wasn't joy. It wasn't pride. It was release. Back at the ranch, the following week, he stood on the porch and watched the sunset. The sky burned orange and gold, the kind of beauty that only comes after a storm. For the first time in years, his hands didn't tremble. His chest didn't ache. The world felt right again. He took out Harold's letter one last time, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the fireplace. As the flames curled around the paper, he whispered, "You were right, Harold. Healing was the only revenge worth having." The fire crackled, the smoke rising like an exhale from the past. Somewhere out there, Susan might have still been crying. Somewhere, people might have been talking about the old man who inherited millions and vanished into the mountains. But Thomas didn't care about any of that. He wasn't the man who'd been mocked. He wasn't the man who'd been broken. He was just Thomas Miller, a man who finally learned that real strength isn't loud, it's quiet, and that sometimes the truest kind of revenge is peace. 3 years passed quietly. The Montana ranch had aged with grace, much like Thomas himself. The fields stretched golden in the summer light, the wooden fences weathered but strong. He spent most mornings on the porch with a cup of black coffee, listening to the hum of the world waking up, the sound of horses snorting, wind cutting through the pines, and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. People in the nearby town called him Old Man Miller. They said he'd been a mechanic, a widower, a millionaire, and maybe even a ghost. But nobody really knew who he was. Thomas liked it that way. He didn't talk about the past anymore. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer owned him. One afternoon, a young man named Jake, a local mechanic who helped out on the ranch, stopped by the porch. "Mr. Miller," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "you ever regret anything? Like not getting even with someone who wronged you?" Thomas leaned back, studying the horizon for a moment before answering. "No," he said finally. "Revenge feels good for 5 minutes. Then it leaves you with the same empty hands you started with." Jake frowned. "But don't you ever wish they'd pay for what they did?" Thomas smiled faintly. "They already do. The world has a funny way of making people face themselves. You just have to stay alive long enough to see it happen." The boy nodded, thoughtful, and went back to work. Thomas watched him go, and for a moment he saw his younger self, angry, heartbroken, desperate to prove his worth. The kid didn't know it yet, but pain has a purpose. It burns away what's fake. That night, as the stars came out one by one, Thomas sat by the fireplace, reading through letters from people his foundation had helped. Single mothers, women escaping abusive marriages, veterans' widows, hundreds of lives rebuilt because of something born from his own heartbreak. He smiled as he read one note from a woman in Ohio. "I lost everything. But because of your program, I found myself again. I don't know who you are, but thank you." He closed his eyes, letting the words settle in his chest. That was it. That was the healing Harold Green had wanted him to find. Later that week, he visited the town's community center, the one he'd helped build, to check on repairs. The walls were lined with photos of families and volunteers. "A local journalist recognized him, Mr. Miller?" she asked, holding a notebook. "I've been trying to reach you for months. People want to know your story. You've changed lives here. Don't you want to share how it all started?" Thomas chuckled softly. "No one needs to hear about my past. They just need to know it's possible to start again." The reporter hesitated. "Can I at least ask one question? What made you decide to forgive?" Thomas looked past her, through the window where sunlight poured across the wooden floor. "Because I realized forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's a key you hand yourself." He tipped his hat politely and walked out before she could say anything else. That evening, as he drove back to the ranch, the sky turned crimson with sunset. He pulled over by a quiet hilltop, the same spot where Harold Green used to sit when he visited Montana. He'd learned that from an old caretaker who once worked for Harold's estate. Thomas got out of the truck, leaned against the hood, and whispered, "You were right, old man. You didn't just leave me money. You left me freedom." He stood there for a while, just breathing in the cool mountain air. When he returned home, he fed the horses, locked up the barn, and went inside. The fire was already crackling, throwing warm light across the room. On the mantel sat 2 photos, one of Harold Green, the other of a young Thomas and Susan, back when life still looked simple. He didn't hate her anymore. He didn't love her either. She was just a chapter. A long one, painful but necessary. He raised his glass toward their photo and murmured, "Thank you for teaching me what kind of man I never want to be again." Then he drank, slow and quiet, while the night pressed softly against the windows. Outside, snow began to fall, silent, steady, endless, and as it blanketed the ranch, Thomas Miller smiled to himself. He wasn't a broken man anymore. He wasn't even the rich man people whispered about. He was just a man who'd made peace with every version of himself. The fire crackled, the wind hummed through the chimney, and the stars hung like small reminders that even the darkest skies can shine again. For the first time in decades, Thomas felt something close to grace. He leaned back, eyes half closed, whispering to no one in particular. Real men don't cry? Maybe not, but they damn sure learn how to forgive. And with that, the old man smiled, the kind of quiet smile that says a lifetime's worth of pain finally found its purpose.